right? Now that you guys know, in the 1600s or 1700s, during that time, the European nations sort of started creating such a fascination on spices. These people developed like a very unusual fascination with spices. They literally started taking over countries just because they needed spices. So how this happened was because, back in the day, spices were quite expensive. That's because the transportation and stuff, it wasn't not that, simple, it wasn't that easy. So because of that, we had like a very limited number of spices. They had a limited number of spices coming their way to Europe. So can you imagine, every year you only have one shipment of spices coming to your country, coming to your continent. To entire Europe, you only have one ship coming for the entire year carrying spices. Can you imagine how rare spices were? And can you imagine how expensive spices would have been, given the fact that these are very rare? So because of that, they realize, okay, you know what, like we have to spend a lot of money buying spices. Why don't we go over and take control of all these nations which produce spices? That's what they thought of. But it's a little complex than that. If you study history, you know that the Turkey had this capital city called, Constantinople. So Constantinople had like a harbor that through that only you got spices to Europe. Now, following that, they were sort of, they were conquered. Like that area was conquered by invaders. So all the spices stopped coming to Europe. Now all of a sudden there's a shortage of spices and it is even more expensive. So that's when they realized, okay, we need to go over, we need to go forward there, take control of these areas, these countries that they actually cultivate spices. Okay. I received a message in the group through DM. Buddhima, why don't you share that with everyone? I think that's an important piece of information. Okay, please put that. So that is an important piece of information, not just for general knowledge, for additional knowledge. Please copy that and share that for everyone. Since I was talking about the Constantinople being conquered, right? Yes, it was like conquered by the Ottomans, right? The Ottoman Empire, and they were quite powerful. So it was a reason that Europe sort of stopped getting their spices. So they became really obsessed with spices. They went like conquering all these other land. So when you go to 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, and even the earlier 20th century, you can see it's the Europeans conquering the entire world. Wherever you go, it's the Europeans conquering all those areas. Okay. Now you see the British, the French, the Spanish, Portuguese, even the Belgians, right? The Dutch, all of these nations were conquering countries all over the world. Now, Asia was mainly conquered by the British, while African nations were mostly conquered by the French. South American continent was mainly conquered by the Spanish and Portuguese settlers, which is why they speak Spanish, the Latinos, right? So there are two ways of colonizing another land. Now imagine, think of us as like a bunch of invaders. Can you imagine like us being all these warriors, and like obviously I have a symbol of being a warrior, right? I've told you guys before, right? I have the qualification to be like the leader of our so we can be like the Vikings. All of us can wear all those chain armored suits and carry swords and all those, and we can go conquer different countries. Okay. So when we go to different countries, there are two ways that we can conquer those lands. Either we can go capture a country that there are no people, and put our people there and settle, bring our families, and just make sure that we live in that land that was not claimed by other people. And if there are like indigenous people here and there, then we can kill them off. Okay, that's one way of doing that. That's what they did to North America. That's what they did to South America. That's what they did to Australia. They just came. The lands were pretty much empty. Those were huge continents. So just went ahead and killed off whatever the indigenous population. They just chased them away and they took those lands and they started living there. The settlers, they settled down there, which is why the Australia, USA, Canada, these countries are white countries now. They are not supposed to be white countries. The indigenous people are supposed to say that, right? White people are coming from Europe. But they settled there. Compared to that, in Asia and Africa, what they did was they didn't like kill the population. They just controlled the population. They came and said, okay, you know what? From today onwards, you all don't have your own king. We are going to control you. And that's the colonization they did in our countries. It also has like two sub approaches because in Africa, they enslaved the local population. While in Asia, they weren't that bad. Like, they were sort of like getting along with us. They weren't necessarily making us slaves or whatever. Right? But either ways, either you colonize a country by going and settling down in empty land, or you go and conquer an already politically organized population. That was the main reason, because you go to America, you see the Red Indians and all those people. They weren't politically organized as a state, which is why the invaders just killed them off or chased them out. But compared to that, the Asian countries, African countries, we already had like properly developed political systems. We already had civilizations going. So because of that, they didn't want to, kill everyone off and start everything from the scratch. They were like, rather, we'll just replace their king and we'll just start conquering them. That's easier. So that's what they tried in our countries. But however, although in the 1800s, 1900s, the British and the French, they were like the villains because they were the ones who were conquering the entire world. Things changed in the 20th century because a man appeared with a silly mustache. You look at his mustache, you feel like he's a comedian. But in reality, don't let the mustache deceive you. He was one of the most ruthless men ever existed, Adolf Hitler, right? And Hitler had a way of colonizing which was like much more brutal, compared to French or the British, whatever they had. He was simply like getting rid of people. They were like saying, okay, Jewish people, they're like dirt, so get rid of them, kill them off. And they were like, ruling with an iron fist. So all of a sudden, the British and the French started appearing as if like, these guys are not that bad. Which is why I recently saw a meme in this history memes page I follow. It said if Hitler never happened, Britain would have ended up being the bad guy in the world history. Now, Britain doesn't seem so bad because we had Hitler, who was like worse. Okay. So after the World War ended, they started realizing keeping colonies was bad. Because people started asking Britain, okay, why were you sort of like attacking Hitler and the German Empire? Because they were like, okay, they were invading other countries and they were like killing people there. They were like, okay. Then they were like, isn't it like the same what is happening here, in British Empire as well? Because in British Empire, aren't you like conquering other countries? French isn't the same thing the French people are doing. So when that question was asked, they were like, okay, you know what? Keeping colonies is bad. So we need to let go of these colonies. So once they started letting go their colonies, those colonies became states. And new countries were added to the world map. You think in 1930s, this entire thing was one country called Britain. We were a part of Britain. We weren't a separate country called Sri Lanka or Ceylon. We were Britain. We were British citizens. Our great grandmothers, great grandfathers were British citizens. Okay. So all of a sudden, now that the colonizer has gone, now we are a part of our own country, our own republic. So this created a new state. So as you can see, compared to the previous states we have studied, like liberal, democratic, or tribal or Greek city states, this has created two different types of states: colonial state and post-colonial state. Colonial state means when you are being conquered by a different country, right? So you had your own country at one point, you had your own king at one point. Now all of a sudden you have this foreign nation coming and conquering you, and they are in charge all of a sudden, right? So that's a colonial state. That means you have a colonizer who is conquering you. That's a colonial state. From 1815 to 1947, we were a colonial state. That means we aren't officially a country. We are a part of a different country, but we are practically a colony. Then once you get independence from being a colony and you're back to being a state, that's what you call the post-colonial state after colonization. Okay, this is a basic idea that you guys need to understand. All right. Okay, so moving on to the colonial state, as we discussed before, right? As we discussed before, colonial state and post-colonial state is something that I have given you the basics, right? I have given you the basics. Now you understand what colonial and post-colonial states are about. Okay. So in other words, colonial state is practically when you have a colonizer coming and take over. While post-colonial state is basically once you get independence, right? Once you get independence, you call that post-colonial state. So about colonial state, what you need to understand is colonial state is a little like, do you have friends who have bipolar disorder? Not up to a level of like disorder, but like a little bit of bipolar. Like the friends who's like in a really chill mood at one point and then who get mad at the sound of you chewing food, right? Like that. So being a little bipolar. Okay. So think about the bipolar person you are, or else you can think about a person or maybe one of your exes who had, really, really good qualities as well as bad qualities. I can see Pankaj is specifically think about a particular person, right? I can read from his face. Okay. One particular person who had really good qualities, but on the other hand, really bad qualities as well. So you ask like, how was that person? You get a little confused. Okay, is that person a good person or a bad person? Because you think, okay, there were these good points, but there were these bad points as well. So you sort of start thinking about it. So it is like that. So colonial state is like that. Colonial state is very difficult to figure out whether it's positive or negative because it had good features as well as bad features. Okay. Now, what are the good features? What are the good features of the colonial state? The good thing about the colonial state is that they brought in all these democratic features. Think about the ancient Sri Lanka we had in our country. Ancient country. There was a king. We had like the feudalists, like, the, what do you call that? The system of these aristocrats sort of like running the entire thing, and people didn't have rights or anything, right? The king had like a power centralized system. So we learned so much about democracy, how important democracy is. Who brought us democracy? Which country brought us democracy? Britain. The British colonial rulers came here and they established legislative councils. They taught us these are elections, these are legislative council, these are executive makes a decision, legislature approves. You have something called rights, there's something called elections, you can choose your government, right? They got rid of the Rajagari system. You don't owe anything to your government. If you are doing a job, you should get paid. They created an capitalistic, free market. They said, it's not like the government can't change all the prices. Someone has to, you can actually go and take part in the market activities as long as, you want to do a business. So the system we currently have, it was created by the colonizers, right? So the colonial state is good. From one perspective, it is fantastic because it brought us all these democratic features. But on the other hand, don't forget, we were still a colony. So they used the military. They used the military to control us. They had a military person as a governor, and it was a bureaucratic system where the military officials governed everything. Think about the British colonial Sri Lanka. Think about the British Ceylon, right? They gave us a legislative council. You remember Colebrook, Crewe McCallum, Manning Devonshire, Donamo. They gave us so many reforms. They let us more and more political rights. But on the other hand, the problem was the fact that they, at the same time, they had an iron fist controlling us. There was a legislative council. But could we change the governor, the British governor who was governing us? No, right? We had local ministers, we had local representatives who were serving as ministers. But could we get rid of the British army? No, right? So we were given independence, but on the other hand, they were ruling with an iron fist at the same time. Okay, imagine something like this. How many of you all have like a fascination with Scandinavian countries? In the previous class, there was a student called Aksa. She had a fascination with Finland. She loved Finland. She was wanted to go to Finland. Are there anyone who's like, other than your fascination with Korea, like, do you, anyone with a fascination about like, Sweden, Finland, Norway? You should Google and check like, prisons in these countries, right? A prison in Sweden, they have saunas, they have like these air conditioned rooms, and they have these gyms and all that. Like, it's better than one of these 3-star hotels in Sri Lanka. They are prisons. So the colonial state was a prison like that. We were in a prison. We were conquered by the British. We were in a prison after all. But at least inside the prison, we were given good things like saunas and like gyms and good food and all that. So we were a colony, but at the end of the day, we received like, good positive features like democratic features like legislative councils, elections and representation and all that. Okay, understand. And another important thing is, now imagine if I want to conquer you people, if I want to conquer you guys, okay, what is the way to conquer you people? How should I conquer you? What is the easier way? If you guys are united, will that make me easy for you to conquer you all? No. If you all are united, it's difficult for me to conquer you all. Which is why there is a theory called divide and rule theory, divide and conquer theory, right? And these colonizers use this in their colonies. How did they do that? They created communal representation. You see, like, unlike our class where we have like, Sinhalese, Tamils and Muslims and other minority like Burger and all that, we get along in our class, right? But if you look outside in our country, we don't get along that well, which is why we had a war and which is why there's a lot of conflicts going on. And one of the reasons behind that is the British. In fact, you look at any war happening in the world based on this ethnic basis and racism, it was created by the British or like whatever the colonizing rulers they had at one point. Understand? So this practically shows that all the issues we have because of racism were created by the colonizing rulers at one point. That's a problem they created. They came and they created problems in our country. They created problems in our country because they divided us. Okay, so imagine that I am a Sinhalese in ethnicity, but I am cool with all the ethnic groups in this country, right? But imagine they appoint me to the Legislative Council as a Sinhalese representative. In that case, I am supposed to represent the needs of the Sinhalese people, right? Now you have Sharon who's a Tamil, right? But let's say they appoint her, like she's cool with all other ethnicities, she's cool with everyone, but they appoint her as a Tamil representative. Now in real life, we get along really well, we are close, but she is supposed to represent the Tamil people, I'm supposed to represent the Sinhalese people. If there is a conflict going on, we are supposed to take sides, and that is going to create conflicts between us. That's what happened in the colonial state. They created a division among people. And as a result of that, it created long-lasting impacts. Pretty much all these countries struggled in the colonial states. They created disunity among people. Okay. Other than that, there is another important feature is that they taught their language to someone. There's this whole thing going on in Sri Lanka about like, posh and gode, right? So what is ideally posh? What do you think posh? Like, it's very difficult to explain what posh is, but just to break it down to in simple terms, if you are Western oriented, if your lifestyle is a little closer to the westernized culture, you are considered posh, right? If you stick to your native identity, that is called gode. That's what's going on. And that was created by the British rulers when they were conquering us. They said, you stick to your native roots, you are from a lower society. you stick to like, what we do? Do you like, if you sort of follow what we do, if you dress the way we do, if you eat the food we do, if you hang around in the places that we do, you are considered posh, right? So that's how this thing was created. Now, when we study Unit 7, we'll see in Colebrook Cameron reforms how this works out. So they taught us English, they opened English education, and they said, if you learn English, you are posh. That means you are privileged. You are from a higher class of the society. If you are a Tamil who speaks Tamil, if you are a Sinhalese who speaks Sinhala, if you are wearing Sinhala clothes, if you are wearing Tamil clothes, if you are wearing like typical Muslim clothes, you belong to a lower class. And that's how the social division was started. And the British haven't been here in 70 odd years, right? But we still have it. Up to date, if you are like being a little westernized, you consider yourself to be a little superior than the others. You look down on people who stick to their ethnic native identity. And that was created by the colonizers. Okay. So we need to keep in mind, they created a social class like that, who sort of like follow them, who sort of go behind the colonizers, who go behind the British people, who pretend to be the British. Okay. So these people were the ones who are known as like so-called posh. If you are like going behind the British people, behaving like them. If you stick to your native identity, you are considered Gode. That means you are coming from a smaller, lower layer of society. So it did make some sense during the colonial times because the British were the ones who ran the government. So unless you are like being like them, you don't get chances. It doesn't make any sense now because like we are an independent country now. It doesn't make sense if you are behaving all British or westernized. How would that make you superior to your natives? It doesn't make sense now because we have an independent government now. Back in the day, it made sense because British were the ones who ran the system. So you behave like them, you're okay. If you don't behave like them, you don't get a chance. It made sense. So anyways, that's how things worked out. They created a social class. And those were the ones who handled all the political powers. Okay. Then moving on to post-colonial states, what you need to know about post-colonial state is that unlike other theories, post-colonial state was created by one particular person. His name is Hamza Alawi. Okay. There was a political scientist called Hamza Alawi. He's a British political scientist with a Pakistani origin, right? He's a Pakistani person who lived in Britain. So Hamza Alawi was the one who created this theory of like post-colonial states. He recognized that countries that have been given independence from colonies have turned into their own sort of like a state version. So what's happening in post-colonial states, the main thing is this. Now, our countries, did we used to have democracy before the British rulers came? Did we have democracy? No, we had a monarchy. All our countries had monarchies. So once the British came, they got rid of all the monarchies and they gave us democratic governments, right? So once the rulers left, did we switch back to what we used to have? Did Sri Lanka switch back to Kandyan Kingdom having a separate king, Lower Country having a separate king, Jaffna having a separate king, and there are like regional kings being here and there? Did we switch back to that? No. We went ahead with that. We went ahead with Ceylon being one country and the entire Ceylon having one government and all that. Okay, that's the first thing you need to understand about the post-colonial state. We went ahead with what colonizers gave us. That's not necessarily a bad thing because what colonizers gave us were like advanced political features like democracy and governments and all that. We didn't go back to be going under a king, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Secondly, there is a problem. You remember how they kept us intact when they had the British colonial system going on. They created conflicts between us. Sinhalese, Tamil, Muslim, everyone, they were fighting with each other. It was the British who created that fire, the tension between the ethnicities, right? Then what happened was, this came back to haunt us. In the post-colonial state, by the time we became like post-colonial states, whatever the tension that was created among the communities back in the day under colonial states became worse. Best example is Sri Lanka, right? At one point, Sinhalese in Sri Lanka were minding their own business, Tamils in Sri Lanka minding their business. The British came and created a tension. They purposely recruited more Tamil people to government jobs just so the Sinhalese majority would hate them, right? So once they gave independence, Sinhalese governments conspired to, push Tamils out of the government sector jobs, put more Sinhalese there, and then make the national language and all that. And at the end of the day, what happened in 1980s? Our country went into a war. So pretty much all the wars that are fought in the world among communities, if you take Sri Lanka, what you can relate is Sinhala and Tamil conflict. It was created by the British rulers at one point. It is sad to see that the democratic legacy that we got from the colonizers, we have failed to keep up with the democratic legacy. Sri Lanka and India are the only two countries that we've managed to keep a democratic government going on all this time, right? Sri Lanka and India are the only two countries in the Asian region, specifically in the South Asian region, that has managed to keep a democratic rule going on ever since independence. We got independence in 1947, India 1948, India got independence in 1947. Throughout, we've always had democratic governments. Compared to other countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, these countries have struggled to keep up democracy. Their governments get out of military governments come. You see Myanmar and these countries, right? So other countries have struggled to keep up with the democracy. They've failed. Sri Lanka and India, we are two exceptions. But even in our countries, we still have the issues that were created by our colonizers at one point. Right? In Sri Lanka, Sinhalese and Tamils have a conflict which led to a war. That was a conflict created by the British rulers while they were here. Similarly, in India, the Hindus and the Muslims have a problem, again, created by the British when they were ruling. Right? So mostly in post-colonial countries, what happens is the majority takes control once the colonizers leave. Now imagine in Sri Lanka, when the British were there, when the British were conquering our country, all of our communities were secondary. Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, Burger and everyone, we were secondary. Why? Who was running the show? The British. Once the British leave, the Sinhalese take control. Now Sinhalese are on top, and Tamil, Muslim, and other minorities, they are secondary, which is what's causing this problem. Same happens in India. You take India, while the British were conquering, okay, British on top. Then you have Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and all the communities. The moment the British leave, the Hindus become dominant, and that creates a conflict, right? Then what happens is the minorities don't feel like they belong in this country. They sort of become rebellious and they start fighting for their own country. They start fighting for their own country. They start wars trying to win a country on their own. Okay, this happened in India and Sri Lanka. Both in India, it was successful. The Muslims in India broke a country on their own called Pakistan. They broke a piece from the northwestern side and the northeastern side both, whereas the northeastern side later broke into a separate country called Bangladesh, different story, right? But the point is, the Muslim minority in India, they fought for a different country. Same thing happened in Sri Lanka, where the Tamil minority fought for a different country called Elam. And that's a war that went on for 30 years. Unlike in India, it wasn't successful here because in Pakistan, of course, they got their country sorted while the British were giving independence to them, right? But in Sri Lanka, Tamils did not ask British to declare a separate country. They wanted to work a federal solution out. It wasn't working out with the extremist governments we had in Ceylon. As a result of that, by 1970s, 80s, they went to a war. Okay. So in post-colonial states, what we can see is that it has been politically quite conflicting. Communities aren't getting along. We are struggling to keep up with our democracy, and it turns out to be it wasn't that good post-colonial states, right? So I believe you all understand colonial state and post-colonial state. I should be starting my debating practices at about 6:30-ish, right? So there are more people here to join. Until they join, we'll read the note, right? Okay. Sharon, please share the note, colonial state. We'll get someone to read. Ranali, can you read colonial state?
Okay, sir. Colonial state. By the 15th century, European nations started to geographically be interested in other continents of the world. Due to Muslim invasions in Europe, specifically the Turkish invasion of Constantinople in 1453, Europeans focused on capturing new territory to expand their rule. Countries in Asian, African, American were North and South were invaded and colonized by European nations. This colonization was aimed at three main goals. Number one, gaining economic benefits, spices, minerals, etc., spreading their religion, and gaining international dominance and reputation. In order to achieve these goals, many European nations, such as Portuguese, Dutch, British, French, and Spanish nations, were in a competition. The state model that was developed in colonized nations due to the political influence of European nations is known as the colonial state. Until the 16th, 17th, 18th, and even at times 19th centuries. Um, Sharanaki, can you scroll?
Sharon, you have to scroll down.
19th centuries, Asian, African, and American countries were conquered by monarchies, while some African and American countries even had tribal states. During the colonized period, the nature of the state of these countries drastically changed as a result of political, economic, and social reforms introduced by the colonizers. The main political transformation of colonies are as follows. um, Asian, African, and American countries existed as in organized state structures before the colonization period. These states lacked a centralized power identity. The country was normally divided into several divisional rulers, and separate legal systems existed in different divisions. Colonizers defeated these divisional rulers to unite the state under one rule and one power center. This had led to the foundation for geographically large countries. B. Although bold democratic features were introduced during the colonial period, colonizers established and maintained their rule through force. Therefore, it can be seen that the colonial state was developed as a military state. C. Although colonizers introduced many democratic features to their colonies, they hesitated to allow advanced democratic features until the very late period of colonized state. Even Great Britain, which was considered the pioneer of modern democracy, still followed the framework led by a military governor, held a similar status as a monarch in terms of power. However, colonies allowed locals to take part in the governing structure. This was later expanded by minimizing the number of locals and minimizing the number of colonizing officers. Ha- uh, so isn't it supposed to be by maximizing the number of locals and
What does he
minimizing
say?
the number of
I don't know. It
how
was later expanded, like by each reform, they minimized the British officials. They allowed more and more local officers as
yeah,
the years progressed.
so
Understand?
by maximizing the number of
So the
locals.
note says minimizing the number of locals.
Right. Maximize the number of locals and minimize the number of, yes. Okay. Correct. Yes.
Uh, However, these locals did not represent their local communities, instead supported the colonizers. This elite class was created by allowing locals in the Western education system. These locals served the colonizing nation by collecting taxes, supporting the rulers to ensure law and order, etc. This social class was intentionally and tactfully created by the colonizers to conquer the colonies more effectively. In conclusion, the colonial state is not a democratic state, but a strong state developed on militarization and administration.
Right. Does anyone have any questions from colonial state? Any part that you don't understand?
So I have an opinion.
Opinion. All right. Go ahead. What's up?
Isn't it ironic how all of this started because of spices and white people still don't have seasoned food?
Yes, that actually is quite interesting. In fact, I saw a meme recently again in that meme page saying Europeans just went and colonized like 80% of the world looking for spices and they are not even using them in their food anymore. Europeans don't use spices anymore, right? Although they colonized like 80% of the world looking for spices, and they ended up creating capitalism and like making all the countries democratic, and they created a new state structure everywhere, and it all started because of spices. Yes, interesting point, Ranali. Thank you. Right, post-colonial state. Sharon, why don't you read yourself post-colonial state, this part?
Post-colonial state. Following the Second World War, plenty of new states were added to the world state system as a result of decolonization. These countries that were given independence by colonies exceeded in the different state formats. Ceylon, India, Pakistan, and several other Asian countries were the earliest post-colonial states as they were established in 1947 and 1948 periods. Following this, Africa and Latin America colonies were also given independence. The theory of post-colonial state was developed by British political scientist with a Pakistan origin named Hamza Alawi in his 1972 article, State is Post-Colonial Societies, Pakistan and Bangladesh. This theory was presented. The article was established in a British magazine named New Left Review, which was also known as a radical Marxist magazine. And other each of post-colonial state are as follows. The post-colonial state continued the structure of the political state with minor changes. Political independence did not mark a break with the colonial past. In post-colonial state, society's democratization did not reach completion after independence. Overthrow of democratic civilian governments by means of military coups and establishment of the authoritarian state has been a common feature among many such societies. The expectations are very few, like India. No.
Exceptions.
I was literally reading it 2 times. What?
Exceptions, not expectations.
Exceptions. Okay, exceptions are very few, like India and Sri Lanka. A special feature of post-colonial state in the presence of the strong military bureaucratic
apparatus, yeah, bureaucratic
apparatus as the central structure of the state power, which is a legacy of the colonial state. Political independence did not alter the existing system in post-colonial states. They were more powerful than civilian political institutions and political parties. The presence of strong military and bureaucratic institutions over civilian political institutions has been an process in post-colonial states, the political societies tend to continue the political format and traditions that were introduced to them by their colonizers. Hence, these countries had not gained independence from colonizing formats despite gaining independence from colonies. Commonwealth countries seem to be continuing with the British Parliament format, while American and French colonies have adapted to similar formats as their colonies. This shows that post-colonial states have failed to come up with their own political formats. Another significant feature of post-colonial state is that the failure to establish pure democracy, unlike their colonies. Other colonies adapted the democratic elements from their colonizers in practical politics. Post-colonies have a weaker version of democracy. In general, the government and rules tend to centralize the abuse political power. In these countries, the majority of general public did not strongly resist this or at times positively support this due to the lack of knowledge on pure democracy. As a result, some post-colonial countries have failed to maintain consistency in democracy due to political and military coups. In fact, Sri Lanka and India are the only countries kept in a mini coup took place in Sri Lanka, which was unsuccessful. Also, the post-colonial states inherited another anti-democratic feature from their colonizers, which was the existence of a strong military and civil authority. As a result, political parties and leaders became much weaker in the political system. The lack of unity between political leaders and parties also contributed to this weakness. Due to the above reason, the political systems of post-colonial countries suffer from the lack of political concentration. In other words, citizens of post-colonial countries are not united under the concept of state. Before colonization, these countries maintained political systems. These are based on regional ruler and regional political system, etc., which depended on the regional identity. Colonizers took steps to change this system by establishing a centralized solitary rule in order to develop the national state. Therefore, this transformation was not natural nor gradual, and it was done by force. Post-colonials stuck to the centralized state format instead of going back to their former political systems even after independence. In this centralized governance, the political dominance was eventually taken by the majority of ethnic groups. Example, the political handled by the South India being handled by the Hindus. As a result of this, minority own territory. Example, the Tamils of Sri Lanka attempting to create a state
Yes, Elam, yes.
Elam. Muslims of India creating Pakistan. Bengali Muslims of Pakistan creating Bangladesh. Therefore, it can be seen that post-colonial states suffer from lack of ethnic unity. However, the roots of,
Yeah, it's misspelled. Supposed to be roots, ROOTS. It's a typo.
Roots of this problem go up to the colonial times as colonizers themselves created separation between ethnic groups by introducing communal representation. This was done to prevent national movements against the colonizers. However, this divide and conquer concept created long-lasting conflicts in post-colonial states.